And it's a good question. But I hope to eventually persuade you that sexuality, the issue of sexuality, is of course very closely linked to the issue of the nature-culture divide or undivide, that it's actually a useful tool for getting at some of the diacritical features of animist and analogist systems, and that in fact it even has relations to hydraulic engineering. But before I begin, can I just say a very quick but nonetheless heartfelt word of thanks to the director and staff of the IRASEC and Chiangmai University for their generosity in inviting me to this session. Now, in keeping with the spirit of a workshop, what I have to say is very exploratory, much more than conclusive, and it's really more a collection of half-baked hypotheses and suggestions than a proper argument. When I was discussing the topic of sexual pleasure with various colleagues during the preparation of a special issue of a journal, I belong to the editorial board, I was very much struck by the contrast between what Asian and African specialists were describing and what I knew of Amazonian ways of engaging with sexuality. And I wondered, almost as a joke initially, if this variation might be accounted for, at least in part, in terms of Philippe's fourfold tableau of the elementary structures of ontologies, and if conversely, an inquiry into construals or conceptualizations of sexuality and the role it's made to play in the mechanics of the cosmos could shed further light on the ways animist and analogist cultural systems order their lived worlds. So I began thinking along those lines, and what I would like to submit to discussion is a very brief comparison between Amazonian animist configurations and analogist ones, both in Asia and in America, followed, if I have time, I'm not sure I will, by some remarks on the possible articulations of such systems to naturalist conceptualizations. So let me begin with a few observations on the status or place of sexuality in indigenous Amazonian societies. In the pages of Triste Tropique, dedicated to the Nambiquara, Lévi-Strauss mentions his puzzlement over the contrast between, on the one hand, the powerful but diffuse erotization or eroticism that pervaded the daily life and behavior of these Indians, and on the other hand, the very limited importance they seem to give to actual sexual intercourse. Though the Nambiquara spent a lot of time on sexual play, Lévi-Strauss says that, and I quote him here, the pleasure sought seemed to him to be less of a physical order than playful or sentimental. And my colleague Laura Rival makes a very similar observation regarding the Huaorani lowland forest groups of Ecuadorian Amazon, when she suggests that for them the pleasure of full sex is really just a moment of intensity, pleasant but devoid of any particular significance, in a broader continuum of sensuality, somewhat like the burst of laughter in a joyful conversation. In fact, it seems that in most Amazonian languages, there is no specific word for sexual climax or indeed for copulation. It is usually designated either by onomatopoeic or gestural expressions, or by terms relating to festive conviviality and or the exuberant play of children or young animals, as is the case among the Quiberoans. And further, what little we know about ordinary sexual intercourse among Amazonian peoples does seem to indicate that it involves very scant ritualization and is not accompanied by an elaborate ars erotica. Now, the reasons adduced by local ethnographers for the erotization of relations between kin and co-residents lies in the fact that in these lowland societies, Physical contact and intimacy, mutual caresses, including genital fondling, and mutual care for the body are, just like the giving or sharing of food, a privileged means of generating kinship relations and kinship positions, which are created rather than given, and more broadly, a means of producing similar conspecific bodies, in other words, of producing fully human ones. In short, caressing and making love are above all a means of producing and expressing bodily sameness, as well as a technique for taming or saming the bodies of others. Hence, the salience of domestic and public expressions of physical intimacy, as well as the blurring of the boundaries between sensuality and sexuality, stricto sensu, as modes of interaction between related bodies. But of course, full sex necessarily involves affines, because of incest prohibitions, rather than consanguineal kin. Now, in the Amazon, non-kin, and this harkens back to what Philippe was talking about this morning, are defined on principle as different, as having different bodies, and this fact structures the sex act as deeply ambivalent because the default mode of relations between bodily different beings is one of hostility, mutual predation. Others, whether human or non-human, are to a greater or lesser degree, according to the instituted social distance between the terms involved, either prey or predators. The sexual act is thus poised between the generalized sensuality linked to the process of creating kin and the predatory impulse inherent to relationships with members of other collectives. Manifestations and symptoms of this ambivalence abound in the specialized ethnography. To mention just a few instances, the general lack of ritualization of marriage, which is seen locally as a process of mutual taming rather than as a specific event, the pervasiveness of stylized antagonism between the sexes in ritual contexts, wherein women are made to stand for the enemy, the other, and are treated accordingly in simulated performances of aggression. The peculiar status of rape, which is quite exceptional in Amazonian societies, both the Guarani and the Achua, for example, consider unthinkable the rape of a woman, including one captured in war, if she does not show signs of consenting to the taming process. And if she does not, she has actually killed rather than raped. The same ambiguity surfaces in the widespread public displays of aggressive erotic play, verbal and gestural, between male cross-cousins, as, for example, among the Matisse, where the two men engage in a game wherein one of the partners insistently caresses the sex of the other to provoke an erection, while the other tries to avoid exhibiting signs of arousal. Or again, as among the Brazilian Paracana, where male friends belonging to different local groups and assimilated to brothers-in-law fondle each other, while knowing that if relations between the two local groups turn sour, they are, in fact, each other's designated killer. Related to this issue is the importance in Amazonian groups of bodily control, expressing indigenous people's efforts either to prevent their bodies from drawing them unwillingly into dangerous relationships, for example in dreams, or conversely, to direct their bodies toward desirable interactions, for instance, with shamanically potent non-humans. And this is one of the lessons attached to the countless episodes of copulation with animals, typical of Amazonian mythology, which is absolutely rife with scenes of zoophily. And in this, what emerges from this mythological treatment of bestiality is that whilst it might be acceptable and even desirable, for instance, on the part of shamans, to interact sexually with animals occupying the position of humans, in other words, with those animals endowed with human behavior and human bodies hidden under their animal skin, it is fatally dangerous to penetrate or be penetrated by a non-human without first engaging in the process of mutual familiarization, characteristic of normal sexuality, aiming at the saming of the bodies involved. And it is significant that mythological acts of zoophily are invariably performed by women, usually with fatal results. And further, it is the animals who take the lead in this process, such that bestiality is construed as a form of revenge on the part of hunted game who retaliate against their enemy hunters by seducing their women. And conversely, the very exceptional acts of real zoophily recorded by ethnographers are always performed only by men and only on dead animals, usually not eaten. And in fact, treating the spoils of game animals in such a manner would expose the hunter to very severe reprisals on the part of the supernatural masters of animals. If we turn now to the genesic or generative aspect of sex, what it produces or can produce, namely offspring, and if more broadly we consider the place occupied by sex in general in the spectrum of vital processes, it appears that sexual coupling plays a relatively minor role in relation to the process of familiarization. Of course, it leads to procreation, but unborn babies are, from the indigenous point of view, merely elements of exteriority that only become fully human, fully kinspersons, through the work of feeding, commensality, and bodily modeling and intimacy his parents engaging. In short, in the production of persons, the act of procreation is less important than the process of adoption or familiarization. And this, incidentally, may be one of the reasons why rites of fertility, in the usual meaning of the expression, are quite rare in Amazonia, except in the Northwest, given that the reproduction and multiplication of plants and animals are dependent on the development of relations to the masters of various species, much more than on the metaphorical genesic seeding of an earth mother type entity such as the Andean Pachamama. And if sexual coupling is actually subordinate to adoption and familiarization in the production of related persons, both processes are in fact themselves subordinate to a prior act of predation, most often homicide. And it's worth reminding you here that the accession to male adulthood in Amazonia, the accession, in other words, to a position of procreator, revolves far more on real or make-believe acts of homicide than on the ritual manipulation of sexualized parts of the body. In short, killing is construed as the ultimate genesic act. Now, while in Amazonia, sexual coupling seems to dissolve into a broader spectrum of eroticized familial good feeling bounded by a lethal predatory urge, in other parts of the world it is framed obviously in quite different ways. And it's striking to note how often in cultural systems clearly governed by analogous principles, it becomes a privileged operator for thinking through cosmological principles and their governing dynamics. In such contexts, it is often conceptualized in hydraulic terms as a nodal point in a cosmological circuitry. So sex becomes vital as a mode of connection involving humans in multiple operations of maintenance, repair, and improvement that assimilate the sex act to an act of engineering. We know, for example, that the issue of management of orgasmic hydraulics was a constant source of debate throughout Chinese history, leading to intense speculation regarding the thermodynamics of cosmic energy. According to Van Kulik, for example, early on in Chinese antiquity, The orgasm was considered a critical moment in vital processes, during which the two twin cosmic forces of yin and yang reinforced one another, like cloud and rains, which were respectively associated with seminal emissions and vaginal secretions. And Taoists and Confucianists competed to identify the best techniques for regulating vital energy, or qi, calculating which aspects of orgasm could be considered energetic gains or losses. And there is a vast literature, for example, on the technique of coitus reservatus, and a wealth of treatises on how to increase qi, all part of a broader quest for immortality. And in the 8th century BC, sexual relations between the sovereign and his concubines were thus governed by an extravagant apparatus of rites and ceremonies recorded in a special register by ladies-in-waiting, whose particular task it was to supervise such relations. So the proper management of the orgasm became, over the course of Chinese history, a major ideological point of discord between Taoists and Confucians. This is an example of the, in a sense, erotization of metaphysics. But cosmological conceptualizations of the sexual act can also lead to its de-erotization in order better to isolate the energetic mechanisms involved in it. Once divorced from the idea of pleasure, it can then be purified into a process of exchange of vital forces, allowing other powers or entities to come into play and transforming the sex act into an event of supernatural cooperation. Ancient Indian tantric traditions provide a good example of such a de-eroticized mystical union. For example, in medieval India, adepts of Kula saw the sexual act performed during a complex and very exacting ritual of initiation as a means of reinforcing vital powers. And the sensory faculties and organs of the yogi and his partner were considered to be divinities, and the carnal encounter as a game of supernatural entities, the two partners joining to become Shiva and Shakti. Pleasure was, of course, not the primary objective of the ritual coupling. It was just a means of performing a metaphysical operation, in other words, the identification of the male and female partner to a divine pair. Not surprisingly, such clearly analogous framings of sexuality tend to be correlated with various forms of overarching cosmological dualisms. And they usually reserve a prominent place for marriage, which is an elaborate and highly ritualized moment of coming together of separate elements of the world, as well as for a wide array of rites and ordinary practices aiming to promote fertility. And interestingly, in such systems, sexuality also generates a high degree of reflexivity, feeding more or less elaborate traditions of the art of lovemaking, and indeed becoming a privileged site for the intellectual apprehension of the workings of the cosmos. These very brief, sketchy remarks on the status of the sex act as a cosmological operator in analogous cultural systems lead to questions regarding the forms of generativity it is associated with, and more generally, the role it is assigned in the production or reproduction of vital processes. As we well know, life is far from being a universal category, if by life we mean a specific ontological domain, a part of nature governed by a particular set of laws and calling for a specialized kind of knowledge, commonly termed biology. But of course, phenomena such as procreation, growth, illness, aging, death are everywhere recognized, and their origin, their causes, and their effects are theorized or speculated on in all societies. Thus, in the hydraulic models alluded to in the preceding paragraphs, all linked to the idea of a circulation of some sort of force or energy, the sex act is construed both as the nodal point of cosmic circulation and the privileged locus for apprehending the dynamics at work in the world's order. If the emperor's ejaculations are so highly codified and ritualized in ancient China, it is precisely because they are simultaneously a model of the processes governing the cosmos, their supreme expression, and also their guarantor, if not their motor. In short, the sovereign's orgasms make the world. A rapid comparison with another example of the thermodynamic scheme will serve, however, to demonstrate the variety of conceptualizations concerning the nature of the energy involved and the role attributed to sexual coupling. Among the Otomi of the highlands of central Mexico, as described by our colleague Jacques Galinier, the force that animates the world is sexuality itself, seen as the dynamic relation between what the Otomi call the half of above and the half below. In other words, between the living and the ancestral dead. As individuals progress through life and engage in genital sexuality, the part from below they all carry, a part that the Otomi call the old sac, and this is a notion that Galinier interpreted as a native theorization of the unconscious, the Freudian unconscious. The old sac steadily, the part of the old sac that they carry, this part steadily grows until living individuals are engulfed by it and must cross over irremediably to the land of the dead. In other words, to the half of below. So in this configuration, men and women cannot but submit to the law of sexuality by reproducing the cycle that leads them from birth to death. And here again, the Otomi consider that the orgasm is a privileged site for revelatory knowledge of the necessary and unescapable relation to the dead. At the same time, the sexual climax is clearly assimilated by them to a form of sacrifice, since each full sex act divests the individual from a portion of his or her life and brings him or her ever closer to the world of the dead. And in this respect, it does constitute, I think, a version in the minor mode of the bloody sacrifices and mainly the self-mutilation that the Otomi's pre-Hispanic forebears carried out in order to irrigate the cosmos with the blood its proper working endlessly required. The differences between these models, premised on the circulation of some sort of force or fluid, and those typical of the Amazonian area, thus, I think, emerge fairly clearly. In the South American lowlands, life, understood as a generative principle inherent to the dynamic of the world, seems conspicuously absent. The principle that governs the movement and metamorphosis of beings is fundamentally the predatory impulse and its attenuated form, sexual drive and desire. This can, of course, lead to procreation, but reproduction is actually an effect rather than an objective. The creation of a new being is just one of the expressions of the cannibal élan that leads to the magnification of self and related family through the capture of values from others, women, children, juvenile animals, potentialities of incarnation, proper names, and so forth. The orgasm as such produces and reveals very little. It simply manifests the conjoining of the predatory disposition and the pleasure of intrafamilial sensuality. There is no need, therefore, for husbanding it, for managing it, for calculating it, or for channeling it, so long as one controls the relations it leads to and avoids confusing them. For example, the relations with one's real spouse and those with a shamanic spirit wife animal. I see my time is already up. So I think I'll drop whatever I had to say about even more half-baked ideas I would have to offer on how these things might eventually combine or not combine with naturalist construals of sexuality, but we can leave that for the discussion, for the general discussion, and I'll drop this part of my talk.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we've had three very thought-provoking and insightful presentations on this final panel. So we will shortly open for a round of discussion, but first I've been asked to provide some comment, which is somewhat challenging for me as I'm in a room of anthropologists and I'm not an anthropologist. But maybe I've been selected because I was first trained as an engineer, which maybe fits somewhat with Jack Critt's presentation. And then a little bit later, my PhD was environmental chemistry. So I'm very interested in these hybridizations of knowledge. But I think also more importantly, perhaps, I feel very inspired by the two-day conference that we've had and the discussions that have been had in the room and the collective knowledge. And so actually my comments will also more respond to what I see as the significance of the coming together of this workshop and potentially a sort of future agenda looking forward beyond this room. So I mean, maybe just to very briefly summarize, as anticipated, like this panel has been broadly on the hybridization of knowledge systems, and Ajahn Jack Critt revealed how deeply social infrastructure actually is and examined the articulation between engineering, bureaucracy, machine, myth, and cosmology. He looked at a detailed history of the technologies of the RID and the people who have sought to use them, to modify them, and to deploy them. And I think very much related to the overall discussion of the last 2 days on like the dualisms of nature and culture, Jack Critt extends the notion of assemblage to include human, non-human, but also cosmological and royal artifact. And if I was to have one question for Ajahn Jack Critt, I would ask, do you see the evidence of the RID deploying mythology in order to attain its modernization goals? Then the second presentation reflected on the intimate relationship between Karen people and ecologies. And highlight, I think, based on what we were discussing a little bit earlier in the last session, highlighted the legal importance, such as the Cabinet Resolution of 2010, with a provision for cultural identity, citizenship, and Indigenous education. And then also, in the creation of these special space and cultural zones, emphasized the linkages between culture, knowledge, ecology, with the importance of place and local practice. One thing that I was particularly drawn to, that I'd like to pick up again in a second, is the relationship between the younger generation and the older generation as a teacher myself, and how you emphasize the practice of learning by doing. And some questions that come to my mind is, as young people go to the city and experience the mainstream education, you talked about innovation, and I think innovation is very sort of interesting hybrid knowledge. So what sorts of hybrid knowledge emerge from the younger generation and the older generation as they explore the different knowledges that they have? But then also, as market relations come into the community, maybe I wonder if this is also a threat to ecologies. So what types of governance or governing mechanisms have emerged that help limit the extent of the market so that things can continue to be used sustainably? For Anne-Christine Taylor, I mean, this is a fascinating paper, which I just simply do not feel qualified to comment on, because I feel that I would not do the paper justice, and there are so many more people in the room that could comment more thoroughly, so I will leave this open to discussion with the help of some anthropologist colleagues. Before turning to the group discussion, I'd just like to put one sort of issue onto the table, which is to reflect on the contemporary challenges of modernization for the human, non-human collective or milieu, and the role of hybrid knowledge and knowledge production, including the role of the researchers in the room. Maybe many of you have heard the phrase that's been coined in around 2000, the so-called Anthropocene. So this is quite common among scientists, and it refers to the age of the human, Pocene meaning the geological age. And the profoundness of this coining is that it refers to a period in time that at no other time in history has existed, or maybe this is for discussion, where humans can transform at the global level, global ecological systems. What this then reflects, I think, is an accelerating modern capitalism and an ever-widening net of market relations. And this, so on the one hand, we see rising economic production and the growing consumption of materials and the productions of waste. Now, it's so hard to picture in our mind's eye what that actually means, but one of the most useful conceptualizations I've heard is the idea of an ecological footprint. And this sort of concept enables us to understand how much we are consuming in relation to how much the Earth can sustainably produce and how much waste we create that the Earth can sustainably assimilate. And the terrible news is that since the mid-1970s, we have moved beyond the so-called carrying capacity of the Earth. Another way, which I also found quite practically to understand what this means, is that this year we consumed all of the resources that we should have consumed for the whole year by August the 2nd, i.e. we are in debt. And the reason I bring this up is because I think the discussions that we're having in this room are incredibly pertinent to both human and non-human entities and the future. But then things are not so simple. When we talk about human and non-human, we also need to disaggregate, because not all humans are behaving in the same way. So the country that on average consumes the most is Australia. And if every country around the world consumed in the same way as Australia, we'd need over 5 planets. The US is close with 4.8. So what many of the case studies I think have discussed over the past few days have brought out case studies that are not responsible for the impending future of the planet as a whole, and yet are incredibly vulnerable to the impacts that may happen, I assume, again for discussion. In other words, actually the relative minority of the world's population are the majority of the resources. In other words, in terms of human-non-human relations, we also need to bring into the equation discussions about justice or injustice. But then one reflection I have on this is that the processes of globalization are enabling a growing distance between the location of production and the location of consumption. And one observation that I have about the cases that we've discussed is there's often a very close relationship between humans and nature in the cases that we've discussed. So there's an inherent violence in the modern food production system and energy production system and so on that is largely hidden out of sight from those that are consuming the vast majority of the resources. In other words, people can, with a relatively clean conscience, consume resources without even being aware of the consequences. For example, the electricity that's powering this room today would be coming from a coal-fired power station or a hydropower station, well away from what we might be aware of the impacts. Of course, it's totally possible to find out what these impacts are, but it seems that there's more of a willingness to be a collective blindness about what these impacts might be, because it might make some of us very uncomfortable. So what is being done in a more conventional sense? So there are recent global policy agendas such as the Sustainable Development Goals that have been mentioned. And I think this is very interesting, maybe a discussion we also might like to have, because I feel that nature is actually absent from the Sustainable Development Goals. Environment is in the SDGs in a very instrumental sense. So when we talk about the SDGs, environment is seen as a natural resource to be exploited largely via the green economy. And that the main meaning of this is efficient and productive, but it maintains the dualism of naturalism. In other words, a great faith is placed in ecological modernization. More radical philosophies such as deep ecology are not present here. So within this dualism, it's already been mentioned that there are Promethean optimisms, for example, of science, technology, and human ingenuity towards fixing the environmental harm now inflicted. Others, such as neo-Malthusians, such as the Club of Rome, anticipate great crises such as overpopulation, overconsumption, resource degradation, which requires an urgent and strong hand, not necessarily a democratic one. Now, there's therefore a sort of body of literature that's emerged in the mainstream academia, which we might call sustainability transition literature. But this is barely transformative. It largely envisions green capitalism. And we might actually label this green neoliberalism because of its faith in reform of private businesses such as through corporate social responsibility, more efficient production consumption systems, including better technology, reduce, reuse, recycle, and essentially market-based mechanisms such as carbon markets. Now, whilst this may result in some forms of changes of behavior, there is little expectation of a profound change in values in the overall regime of capitalism and its associated mass consumption. And I think this is what we're talking about over the last 2 days. This is not to say that there hasn't been some form of ontological shift. As was brought up in the last session, and Professor Descola mentioned about recent legal innovations, such as in New Zealand, how there's been a personhood given to a river. In other words, the river can be understood to act as a person in a court of law. There have been other examples, such as now this idea may be taken up by India for the Ganges River. Whilst it's still human-centric in a sense, probably so as to fit the existing legal structure that is itself anthropocentric, it would suggest a slight shift in what is seen as intrinsic value as to what is given standing in a legal case. So often I question the role of the academic researcher within this role, and I think this is a discussion that would be interesting to have. Alex Loftus, who writes on political ecology, that I feel closest to, who works on water, and he works in a very materialist and relational approach, observes that what often draws both students and teachers to political ecological research is a sense that something is not quite right in the world. And maybe this resonates with many of the people in the room. There have been points of discussion over the last 2 days of examples of social movements acting to challenge what is perceived to be an undesirable policy or project that could negatively affect the human, non-human collective. We might ask how researchers' work might support, complement, or potentially undermine potentially progressive movements. Alex Loftus agonizes over the responsibility of researchers in knowledge production that shapes to a degree the future terrain of human governments, society-nature relations, the materiality of nature, and the production of ontologies. This includes the relationship of working with communities and activists, and potentially non-human entities if we're really moving beyond the naturalist ontology. In other words, he encourages a reflexivity of the researcher to question their own position and role within the production of knowledge and its implications, and the hybrid knowledges that we are creating. This relates to our research questions, our research design, the representation, and who indeed is the knowledge producer. He encourages the idea of practical, critical knowledge alongside academic knowledge. So RCSD and my program with MAIDS have, for example, been endeavoring to, in a project of transdisciplinary research approaches, to really think how knowledge production can help move forward with a more progressive agenda. So, I mean, in conclusion, why I want to share this with this meeting is that, I mean, applied ethics literature towards public policy often differentiates between behavior and changing values. And human behavior, in principle, can be changed by policy instruments, but that does not always imply changing values. I think what we're discussing in this meeting is the changing of values or the changing of an ontology. And this is coming from a non-anthropologist, so apologies if I get the terminology incorrect. I think that the discussion on this panel, and more broadly over the last 2 days, includes important wisdom that could be projected into broader public debate and deliberation. For example, in the contemporary high-level public policies such as the SDGs, where we have this idea of sustainability transition, maybe we should actually be talking about ontological transition instead. Because at the heart of public policy lies the core values of society, which reflects an expected behavior of society. I don't have the answer as to how we achieve this, but I'm thinking that the role of the university and the role of academic researchers are really quite key, because it's through our knowledge and production that we contribute towards an understanding of ontologies. So this may be reflected in our research agenda and our methodology that becomes increasingly transdisciplinary, incorporating a wide range of knowledges and values, including human and non-human. We stimulate public debate that challenges existing practices and introduces new ideas, collaborate with movements that can encourage the transformation of ontology, and in an everyday practical sense that we can do every day, we can improve our curriculums and teaching, working with students, which I think is what I was also thinking with Ajahn Praset's presentation. So I'd like to put onto the table some questions around what we might do beyond this workshop. And I'm very inspired by the 2 days that we've had together. Thank you. So now we should open the floor to discussion for the 3 presenters. And if anybody would also like to help me with some of the questions that I have, I'd be very happy. Thank you. Can I invite questions? Yes.
Thank you, Carl, for these very thoughtful comments. I would like to react to some of the questions. Perhaps a major question that you asked, it's about the Anthropocene. I think that one of the major challenge that the Anthropocene poses is the question of scale. Ever since I started working in Amazonia and all the colleagues who were doing the same kind of research, we became convinced that indigenous people, in particular in this part of the world, were in fact building their environment. So there was no adaptation. So the concept of adaptation, which was dominant in the natural sciences, in ecology, and in economics, even in the general social science, in anthropology, for instance, has been bust because we have been able to show in different parts of the world that people were in fact actively transforming an environment which appeared as untransformed. And of course the case of Amazonia is quite telling in the sense that now we know that approximately between 1/3 and a half of the Amazonian forest is completely anthropogenic. It's been transformed by the various techniques of shifting cultivation, where people transplant plants from the forest in the gardens, and it's been repeated for the millennia, and which means that the floristic composition of the forest is in fact the effect of human intervention. We know that also because of the anthropogenic soils that now that pedologic research has been going on in the Amazon. That there's a huge amount of anthropogenic soils, and in some cases it's very deep. It has even a specific name in Brazil, in Portuguese, the terra preta do índio, the black soil of the Indian. And this has been repeated in different parts of the world, even in places like Australia, where the bush fires have been shown that have been going on for 60,000 years, profoundly transformed the environment, etc. So progressively, over the past, 20, 30 years, we've been beginning to think in terms of interactions between humans and non-humans, and not adaptations of societies to environments. And I think it's a great progress. And of course, in this shift has meant that, in particular, the local knowledge of the local population played an important part in this co-constitution of ecological niche. But now the Anthropocene poses a major challenge in the sense that adaptation is back, in the sense that it is not a local population that has to adapt to a local ecosystem, and transform, of course, this ecosystem over the millennia, but that the whole humanity that has to adapt to a major shift, and this shift, of course, is global warming, and global warming, which is now, I mean, the most common estimates are among climatologists is between 3.5 and 3.7 degrees at the end of the century, which implies, of course, major changes in many parts of the world. And this requires an adaptation. Hence, what we've been discussing here, which was mainly local assemblages of humans and non-humans, producing milieus, has to be thought at another scale of how this collection of local, and when I mean local, I don't mean only local in Southeast Asia, in Amazonia, etc., but also in Europe, in North America, in Australia, etc., can go towards a combination where they would, at the same time, and in some cases, go on doing what they've been doing, that is reaching a sort of homeostasis, let's say, with a given set of non-humans, and at the same time globally reacting to this major threat for the Earth system, which is the global warming. And so I have no answer to that. But I think it's one of the challenges that we have to face. That is the combination of the local and the global, and there's no easy solution to that. So it's. I said I was optimistic in the morning, but I'm pessimistic about that.
Thank you. Okay, we have a yes.
Okay, my name is Nadanai. I am a young people of Karen. And I want to add something in the presentation of Ajahn Prasad about the young people. We have a challenge not only in Karen, not only in Thailand, but in the world. Like young people go out from community to study and work in the big city and not come back. And not have a people to maintain the traditional knowledge, way of life, identity. They lost everything. And this is a big challenge. And in Thailand, in situation in Thailand, like in Hilanai, we do rotational farming, shifting cultivation to in a traditional way in communities. We can answer about consumption base. We have a lot of food around here, like a seasonal food, like that, and very good qualities. This we can answer, but we cannot answer about the income. Because sometimes we see Hilanai is in forest, right? But sometimes we want to pay some cost, like to send a son to go to school like that, to go to hospital like that. This is problem of indigenous people cannot answer this point. And some of community change to the mainstream. To the mainstream, like to plant corn, to send to a big company like that, use a lot of chemical. Because they don't have chance to do. They lost identity. They lost traditional knowledge because they don't have chance. And we young people, we in Hilanai and current communities, we decide to do like a social enterprise, like in the branding, to make our branding, but not only to make the income like a company like that, but we want, the main point is we want to communicate our story, our traditional knowledge, like a rotational farming. Because in Thailand, people in Thailand not understand us about rotational farming, and they try to attack like a policy, like indigenous people is cut the forest, destroy the forest like that. We want to change the mindset of people in Thailand. And the very important thing is we want to make young people proud in your identity, in your traditional knowledge, in your way of life. And this, I think this mechanism can make young people come back to communities and develop, and not only to develop, but to make that innovation to make traditional knowledge. We call, for us, we call like, we are a bicultural person. We know outside and we know inside. And we can make a new innovation to maintain our traditional knowledge in modern way. Thank you.
Thank you. Ajahn Prasad, would you like to respond?
I agree with him, but I like to add a little bit, especially the case of the young people. I think that very challenging situation, yeah, even in Thailand or other countries, and we lost our roots, knowledge, and something like that because education, modern education. We only study only one side, but don't have chance to study our own way and traditional knowledge. This I think that the challenge is how to create both sides to the young people. That very challenge the space for the young people to learn, to continue and to practice in this process. That the challenge. That Nadanai told something about how to create space for young people. I agree with him on that young people need to work with young people. We are a little bit old, sometimes we are not understand the young people, so the young people can work well to each other. That one thing. Another thing I think that the traditional knowledge and way of life or cultural base is very important. I think that I can say that among multiple knowledge, one or indigenous knowledge is one that we need to. We still need it for the recovery this world, the ecology, way of life, and all kinds of that. Even to respond the challenge question of climate change. Also, this also another way that we need to. We need to give the what we call important or this traditional role involved with the process. I agree with that. Innovation, adaptation also need to integrate of the two knowledge that need to come together. This is something like that.
Thank you. Yes.
So my comment is, or my kind of discussion point is in response to the question of scale in regards to the Anthropocene, and the point, Professor, you made about adaptation as becoming kind of increasingly on the agenda, and potentially that as kind of a point of positivity, looking to the future. I'd like to kind of raise a pessimistic point regarding adaptation in relation to how it's become incorporated at the international level in terms of development policy, particularly around the discourse of sustainable development. There's some work coming in kind of critical security, critical political sociology that looks at the relationship between the adaptation agenda, particularly around resilience, within the discourse of resilience and sustainable development, and how it's based on an ontology of vulnerability, in which the human subject is no longer kind of create or understood as a subject that can kind of secure itself from the uncertainties of the natural world, if you like. And I'd like to kind of pose that as a potential problem or stumbling block for policy within the neoliberal age, in which it seems adaptation becomes an excuse to divorce responsibility from the state to the market. And then the market becomes the vehicle by which adaptability then can be achieved. And there's a tendency at the level of scale to reduce, therefore then try to solve such a problem by putting forward policies that are very small in scale, right? Folk policies. We change our habits at the day-to-day level, turn off the light, don't use plastic, et cetera, that I think don't really address these massive planetary kind of issues. And by posing this, I don't mean to say that adaptability is not necessarily something that we can kind of try to reimagine, but there's been a tendency, I think, in terms of international development discourse to shift it towards kind of a neoliberal kind of variant. And I think that connects to what Fred Jameson says, right? It's easier to imagine, right, end of the world than it is to imagine end of capitalism. And this has to kind of, I think, come into the debate somewhat, right? Imagine kind of alternative futures. So just a point to throw out there. Thank you.
Is yours a continuation, or maybe?
Yes. That's great, right? There is a profound lack of vision of what the end of capitalism could possibly look like. We have no we have no concept of what it could look like. And the solutions are, you know, adaptation. And what I'm finding where I'm working is, you know, who is adapting, right? So the Karen, for example, in Cambodia, the Kui, they are being asked to adapt, right? And to move aside so that we can have Red Cross and so we can, you know, have some other, you know, really important market mechanisms to solve this problem, which is fascinating, right? But there is, and part of the conversation that we're having here, I think, is a part of the larger potential reimagination of what it could look like, right? What does the end of capitalism look like? And for my part, as an academic, I've been doing a few things, you know, some of which make me a little unpopular. I know you guys are really surprised to hear that. But one is to say things like, I'm talking about market-independent people. These are people, the Kui indigenous people that have been living in Prey Long, lived for generations as market-independent people. And they are now being asked to be market-dependent. Now, the way that the normal literature talks about them typically is forest-dependent people. So I'm shifting the vocabulary. They are market-independent people. And as I go about my field works, one of the questions that I ask is, how much food do you buy from the market? Are you independent of the market? And what will you do if the market stops coming out here? Right? What is the plan? There's some other things that I do. There's a lovely little bit in development speak where these people are particularly vulnerable because they're dependent on natural resources for their survival. Okay, you know, we are each and every one of us dependent on natural resources for our survival. You know, and so to really critically engage with the language that's used in these policies to talk about what it is that's going on and to disrupt that narrative in ways that are hopefully problematic. I sometimes write in religion and in treating spirits and in taking this ontological turn, if you will, which I think is a very distasteful phrase, but to talk about spirits, to talk about other entities in the same way that the people I work with talk about them, and I send it in for peer review. Oh my, I get some really interesting comments back from peer reviewers about this kind of framing. Well, don't you mean that they say it's like that? And I, you know, come back and say, well, it's supposed to. I say it this way in order to make you uncomfortable, just a little uncomfortable. So, thank you.
Professor Discola?
Well, yes, it's a comment and a question also. The comment is about precisely as you were mentioning the question of income. When we started living with the Achua 45 years ago, there was no money, there was no market, they were completely isolated, they lived out of their interaction with non-humans, etc., etc. And then we have seen progressively schools coming in, the state or NGOs, missionaries, etc. And so now there's a need for income for very simple reasons. They are a polygynous family has about 20 children. 20 children need to be clothes to go to school. And so you have to buy the cloth. You can't weave it with cotton for 20 children, etc., etc. So the very basic things. And one of the way perhaps out of this, which is beyond language, I was wondering, and that's a question for Robert Farn, and I was wondering what you think of it, is universal income. That is the proposal that any citizen of the earth receives a certain income through the national states, which would allow them to live, whether out of this income or not. So this was a proposition by one of the campaigners in the last presidential elections in France, where you met 6% of the votes. So obviously it's not, it hasn't, and of course it was met with skepticism for a variety of reasons, in particular because in fact neoliberalism and Marxism in a way have conspired over the past two centuries to make work as a central, work as the constitution of the dignity of humans. No, you are human because you work, and so work is intangible in that respect. And if you receive money from the state in that sense, you are not really a human. You are just an assisted person, which means you are trash. So I was wondering what you think about universal income as a way, well, it's one of the ways out of this predicament.
Just in principle, I like the idea, but I'm skeptical of its kind of the political agenda that is potentially behind that in application, if it is used as a way in which to justify the drawing back of the state in other aspects of life, which I think it could potentially be symptomatic of a larger kind of neoliberal agenda, for a lack of a better word. So if we afford all citizens of a particular state a universal income, we can therefore draw back in funding of other, what we could potentially consider as public services. So allowing the marketization of other aspects of social life on the basis that we're providing a fixed income for everyone. So, I mean, in terms of how it's going to be, would be applied as policy, I'm interested in it as a form of experimentation, because I think at the very least it's an attempt of reimagining how we can maybe reorganize society. So I'd like to see it. But I, to be honest, I don't know enough about how it would be implemented to, just, fall down on either side. But my general inclination is like, why not? Why don't we see this in action and see how it would play out? Yeah.
Okay. Any questions for the panelists or comments?
Yep. Yeah, I'll have a question for Anne-Christine. If we project not the idea of a sustainable sexuality, but let's get closer to this. If I understood the not say the transition, but the comparison between the animism version of sexuality and then the analogic one, can you just give a few insights of what would be, of course, how to say that, what's here?
The what?
No, I mean, our present version of sexuality with all the market it is about now for a few minutes, of course. What would be the part of non-humans in this? And as a matter of fact, if I understand the transitions, is that sexuality is more and more invested by things. The circularity that goes through this nodal point gets larger and larger, and finally, this is exactly the same. I would say the same problematic as just to what we are listening and to your remarks on the overall evolution of the economic development models. So I would say how sexuality gives, what kind of insight can give the evolution of sexuality on these kind of models, and how sexuality finally gets a good idea of what do we wait from one to each other, something like this. I don't know if it's a tricky question or not, but I'm sorry, I know that. But
as you know, and this is something that we discussed and investigated a little when we were working on this issue of terrain. Sex with machines, non-humans. Sorry. With machines, with robots, with androids of various kinds, with cyber sex, with God knows what, is developing very fast. Sex is obvious in naturalist configuration. If there are two major, I think, or major dimensions that have been pointed out by all the special theoreticians who've worked on the history of Western sexuality. One, of course, is that just as in analogous systems, sexuality is a major site, a highly important strategic site, but for very different reasons than in analogous systems. In natural systems, it's a major site for the playing out of where the division between nature and culture is going to go through and how. A second major, and of course, as we know, since the end of the 19th century, there's been a huge drive to naturalize sex, accompanied by the development of a vast number of measuring machines to test it, measure it, quantify it, and so on, starting with Charcot's machines for hysterical women to Masters and Johnson, God knows what. This on the one hand. The other major thing is the investment of sexuality by market forces. It's a well-known fact that the huge rise in prostitution, typical feature of 19th century Europe, for example, and that is something that is still very, very much to the forefront. So the question is not so much, it seems to me, whether non-humans are going to complicate it, but rather whether sex with non-humans can escape the market, in a sense. And on the face of it, it seems to be very much the contrary. And in fact, sex with machines tends to, cyber sex and so on, tends to go very much in the direction where the market forces seem to be leading sexuality, Western sexuality, namely into increasing solipsism. And in fact, that's the major, in a sense, the major effect of naturalization on sex is that it's deconnected from its connective tissue it had in analogous or animist systems, to branch it directly onto the market, on one hand, and onto to harness it to nature. The two things go together because, of course, if you objectify, transform sexuality into nature, it also becomes an exploitable resource, legitimately exploitable resource. So I think the question of where sex with robots might take us is not necessarily a particularly optimistic horizon, I think.
Any final questions or comments?
Just last aspect, the disconnection between sexuality and filiation.
Yes.
Kinship. That maybe because you were talking about the market, the artificial sex, but so this is because this play in both sense. So the act of sex is not related directly to procreation, and in reverse now, procreation is not necessarily related to the act of sex. So isn't it a new step forward? I mean, do you see that as transforming the naturalist regime of sex, or just perpetuate it?
More of the same, I would say,
More
in naturalist terms. Just being twisted more and more by both by the combined forces of naturalization and market forces, I think. But who knows?
It's part of the global warming, I guess.
Just I want to add something about maybe a possible solution, I don't know, but to the challenge of finding local, connecting local and global solution to Anthropocene. But not only is a movement you probably heard about, is about the commons. Mm-hmm. Making commons and putting seeds, knowledge and the maximum of goods that we produce in the public domain, because we have, and it's a real challenge even for artificial intelligence now. All the data that we put in internet, even personal data, are privatized and transformed to make intelligent research engines. So I think probably it's part of all our responsibility to be engaged in a movement of giving to these common things more importance. It's a political affair. Just what I wanted to say to conclude.
I would also add on, I mean, I'm also very keen on the idea of the commons, I mean, because it's, rather than privatizing value creation, it's about co-creating together. And there's so many fascinating models now of evolving ways that we can share without having to commoditize things. Without going back to an in-depth discussion on the Anthropocene, I think that one other sort of warning about Anthropocene is the way that it is also rendered technical. So I've seen presentations by Johan Rockström, who is, I forget the name of like a Stockholm Resilience Center, something like that, where he envisions that science can help deal in a sort of Earth scale form of engineering, like so-called geoengineering. This is very Promethean thinking towards the sustainability or the survivability of the planet. And what he imagines is some form of global council of scientists who could guide and govern the governments. And I think this kind of then is a particular claim for authority and expertise that we see in many other places that is very exclusive in terms of its value systems and therefore potential solutions. And I think this is where the discussion that we've had over the last 2 days is very sort of counterpoint to this, because it actually recognizes the value of diversities of knowledge that get excluded from those spaces of discussion. And so I hope that this just maybe through commons and commons production of knowledge that will be in the public domain, what we've discussed over the last 2 days should be further deliberated. I'm sure it will be. Excellent.
It's a very interesting question, the comments, and as you know, there's been a very strong debate among, in the Americas at least, among native societies, collected, whatever, as to the copyright on traditional knowledge. And it has opposed some native groups that, very rightly so, were opposing biopiracy, which has been going on, especially in Amazonia, for a long time, and others who were having a different attitude, saying that commoditization is something which we don't want to enter into. So every knowledge should be accessible to anyone. Because if we start claiming a copyright or even deriving an income from our knowledge, we'll enter into precisely a market situation, and we don't want to do that. And it's interesting to see that this very, very important question is within the debates of native societies in relation to the market and in relation to what is knowledge and to whom would knowledge belong to.
I think the thought in my head may be related to this conversation. I'm thinking about representations, and I think Robert Farnham mentioned the sort of politics of representation. And I remember Ajahn Chayan at the beginning talking about the way the Naga cult has now become commodified for tourism. So this is a concern as we talk about these different ontologies. I'm thinking about what do we do with the problem of sort of coming to deeper understandings of other ontologies, other ways that humans and non-humans can live, and with how that gets represented. because certain kinds of knowledge, say Native American knowledge, is always gets distorted as it moves through market systems, as it gets captured and reified and presented in certain ways. And I think that, so part of the struggles that we're talking about now is how to sort of retain some of the, I don't know what words to use, the authenticities of these other frameworks, other ways of understanding and being in the world. And I'm reflecting on, in the United States, the social movement around the pipeline going through, I'm spacing on the name, the DAPL, yeah. And one of the things that I was really profoundly moved by that movement was the political effort on the part of activists to really frame the movement, to really insist on their language for describing what they were doing. And I was also really moved, connecting to, I remember this group of Maori came to support the movement, and they did one of their traditional dances to curse the company, to use their power to confront the company, and the insistence that they did not want their dance portrayed on media because they knew the way it would be represented would detract from its power, So, I think there's a really interesting struggle that I was watching, about, and maybe it comes from, people who can still cultivate the older ontologies. I don't know if older is the word, because I realize they're all transforming into each other. I've been taught over these 2 days, but, to be able to control the representations or to struggle for how things are represented. I'll stop talking.
Can I add to that? There's a whole other discourse with ascribing agency to non-human entities also gets co-opted so that the company can say, it was this electrical current with its own agency that came racing through our plant and destroyed everything. We can't possibly take responsibility for the agentive actions of nature, right? And this is definitely coming into mainstream academic literature and also policy literature in a different kind of co-optation of this insistence that more than humans have agentive capacities.
There are no more final interventions. I think probably we should conclude the panel and hand over to Ajahn Chayan. So if no, then please join me to thank our three panelists for 3 excellent papers, and we'll move to the next session.
It's difficult for me to find enough words to describe the feeling of our colleagues and myself with regard to these two-day workshop led by Professor Philip Descona. But anyway, I will say something about it. These particular international workshops on culture and nature has some uniqueness that I would like to share with you. Many of you here know that RCSD, which is situated under the Faculty of Social Sciences, has organized many conferences and workshops. But this one is very unique in particular. First, it's a collaboration between RCSD and IRASEC. And here, of course, we hear the French tradition of French ideas with regard to the how to reconceptualize culture and nature. I think this is quite unique for us in a way. And I hope that we can continue this tradition. Second, most of our workshop and seminar tend to focus upon the Greater Mekong sub-region, sometimes Southeast Asia. But this time we learn more about the Amazonian world, the Siberian world. So this is a kind of new approach to what we have been used to do. So we are now learning more about comparative anthropology, comparative methodology. But more than that, I think the two-day workshop is quite intense, and it's a really challenge for several of us here. Some of those who came yesterday, they said that they cannot follow because they have not read the work by Professor Descola first. But for many of us who are here, we are very grateful for Professor Descola, who have spent his time visiting the field work, the field sites, visiting Doi Kham led by Joe, and also stay in this conference, engage in not only in giving 2 lectures, very inspiring lectures, but also engage and intervene in several discussions that is going on in this room. We, of course, have learned new vocabularies, particularly learn about the ontological regime, the mode of identification, about the differences and similarities between analogism and animism, which are quite new for all of us here. And not only these 2 terms, but also the other way of looking at relationship between people, or humans and non-humans. I'm glad that Stephen also shares some interest with me on the Nagas. And also, I also played the Beatles when I was young too, so I know what you are talking about. But the topic that has been brought up in this 2-day workshop is very interesting because it representing a new way of interpreting the intertwined relationship between culture and nature. Here in our RCC program, we are very much influenced by development study paradigm, focusing upon political economy, political ecology. So we do not much, our students and our colleagues do not pay much attention to these non-human beings, the interiority and the subjectivity as much. Of course, our student and my colleagues work on local knowledge. Dr. Prasad is a good example who has graduated from our program and also work on local knowledge. Ajahn Pinkel is another example who work on local knowledge and political ecology. So there are several, including Ajahn Sakrit also working on this riverscape about nature as well. But so far we have not been exposed to a new kind of a way of looking at or re-examining the relationship, the complex relationship between culture and nature, particularly the potency and the subjectivity of both humans and non-human beings. We have not ventured into that direction. So this is a very unique, very important for us, and I hope that the way in which Professor Descola has shared with us, the knowledge that he shared with us, and also reminding us all the times that his mode of identification is only a heuristic device, not a fix, not something which is static, but has to be contextualized. It has to be understood in a more comparative, cultural, ecological, cosmic context, right? So I would like to heartfully thank Professor Descola for his intellectual contribution to us, to the workshop, and to colleagues here. And wonder as well that what will be the next after this, right? Beyond this particular workshop, what is beyond the beyond of culture and nature? Of course, I wish to welcome Professor Descola, maybe next year or 2 years from now. Maybe he can revisit us, learning more about, or learn together about the Southeast Asian animism or analogism or sexuality. There are lots of prostitution here. Here is in 1995 is the capital of HIV/AIDS, Chiangmai. So, but I think what the merit that I got toward the end of this workshop is a more concern about the future, about whether we are moving toward more Anthropocene, market-driven, not forest-dependent, indigenous people. How about the young people, like what Nat Danai has expressed, and his concern, or about the Gui in Cambodia. So I wish that these kind of forum, these kind of exchange, but with a kind of intellectual input from leading scholars like Professor Descola, would help us to rethink about what we are doing, to re-examine. In fact, I was wondering to ask Professor Descola as well, can we apply your concept of hierarchical animism in the academia, for example? Okay. We also part of this animism of the academia, right? Or analogism in the academia. So I hope that we can look forward to more exchange. Even though this morning I'm very delighted to hear that Professor Descola is very helpful, very hopeful of the news and about the movement in New Zealand giving citizenship to the river. But this afternoon, the late afternoon, he seemed to be less optimistic, right? So next time, maybe if you hear more about situation in Southeast Asia, perhaps there will be see more optimistic opportunities among us. Right? So I have to bring this international workshop to the end, and with appreciation, grateful towards Professor Descola, and particularly all paper presenters, and of course colleagues from IRSEC, Claire, Abigail, Stefan, who are behind this beautiful, not hybridity, but synergies between ISREC and RCSG. Thank you very much.
I will be very short. I just wanted to add some thanks, special thanks, because I forget somebody which is very important, which is the CNRS, le Centre national de recherche scientifique en France. Professor Descola is a golden medal of CNRS, and I forget completely at the beginning to mention that the representative of CNRS in Singapore was unable to come, Luc Le Calves, and he sent his representative, Cyrine, which is here, and I wanted to mention that she comes specially for the event from Singapore in order to talk about this event in France and in the newspaper of CNRS. So I'm sorry for forgetting to thank you, Cyrine, to come from Singapore. And I just also wanted to thank you nominally some persons. So first of all, Professor Descola and Professor Taylor to give us the privilege to have you during this workshop. It's really a great privilege, and it was a really fascinating workshop. I would like to thank you so much, Professor Chayan, and I'm sure we will continue to collaborate, IRSEC and RCSD. And I would like to thank very much Mali and Kanchana, Kwanchewan, and Masuk. Thanks to them, we have a really wonderful moment before this workshop and during. I know that it's a lot of work, and I wanted also to thank Abigail and Stéphane, also Olivier from IRD, who also participate in the organization. And I would like not to forget our staff in Bangkok, who work very hard to organize all that. Bertrand Baillet and Soumanan, they were also they spent a lot of time and energy to organize all that. So thank you a lot also for Chakrit and Carl Middleton. I just wanted to remember that this workshop is a result of a seminar we organized with you in Chulalongkorn, and I wanted to thank you to be there and to contribute to the success of this workshop. So thank you to all the participants, all the discutants. And Joe, yes, sorry. Also, I wanted to thank Joe, and it was on the list, but sorry, I forget. Joe and also Louis Gabod, who is not there now. And so it's a lot of thanks, but I really hope that we will continue to collaborate all together. And so thank you for all your work. And I forget still my colleague Anne, sorry, because we always talk about our colleague in Bangkok, but Anne, which is working in Phnom Penh, and she come with her two students from Cambodia. So I wanted also to say her thank you for coming and participating, and to Ling, she come from Vietnam, especially for the conference. So thank you to you all.